It's also important to understand what allowed us to have that good news part of that particular graph. And it's quite clear that for the first 20 to 30 years that we saw that fall, that it had really nothing to do with the way in which we treated cardiovascular disease, but more in terms of the way we identified risk factors, managed them, or ensured that they did not develop to find expression. And 2/3 of the decline has been said, in the words of the authors in this article in the CMAJ, as a consequence of prevention. Salim Yousuf at McMaster University has done some monumental epidemiological work around the globe in terms of looking at the modern pandemic of non-communicable diseases, principally cardiovascular disease, and has shown, contrary to popular opinion and contrary to the opinion of many in the world of cardiovascular medicine, that 90% of all myocardial infarctions can be accounted for by 9 risk factors. And that myth, which was prevalent several years ago as a consequence of an ill-timed, ill-informed New England Journal of Medicine editorial that said that risk factors only explain 45 to 50% of cardiovascular disease, has been eclipsed by Salim Yousuf's work, who showed that 6 factors, smoking, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, psychological stress, and disordered lipoprotein levels, account for and can predict with unerring certainty the likelihood of having a myocardial infarction. And 3 factors, an adequate diet in terms of fruit and vegetable intake, exercise, and moderate amounts of alcohol can have a very profound effect on reducing the likelihood of having cardiovascular disease. The other good news when one looks at cardiovascular disease prevention is that with the exception of chronic mental health issues, if you address cardiovascular risk factors in your practice or we address them in our community, we are addressing the risk factors for all of the contemporary chronic diseases that our society must confront. And success in terms of addressing these risk factors comes from doing something as ordinary as doing ordinary things extraordinarily well, in accordance with evidence-based best practice approaches. And for the next few minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the approaches that are emerging or are evolving, or reinforce some of the approaches that we have been taking. All of you, I am sure, are very familiar with the concept of calculating cardiovascular risk using a risk engine like the Framingham model, et cetera, but it is worth reminding ourselves that the predictive power of the Framingham model, which is embedded in so many of our lipid guidelines, et cetera, was basically determined on 468 middle-class white males and females living in a suburb outside of Boston. And new approaches to the identification of risk have emerged, and one of them, which has found great promise in United Kingdom and in Europe in particular, does not require an assessment or a measure of lipid levels in order to accurately predict risk. And this approach was validated not on 468, but almost 2 million patients in the United Kingdom Health Service. And so it's important that we understand that risk scores are derived from populations but applied to individuals, have not generally been evaluated or applied in younger populations, and that the obesity epidemic changes everything as a consequence of its impact, potential and already proven impact on cardiovascular disease rates. And so we need to think about cheaper, more effective, more easily applied approaches to screening. And this is but one, and I won't deconstruct this particular graph. I just showed it to let you know I do occasionally read a journal. But what we do see on these 2 curves, what you probably cannot notice, is that there are actually 2 lines in each of those curves, one being men and one being women, showing the identical results from a predictive perspective of a test that really just assesses weight and height as opposed to measuring lipid levels in terms of assigning risk scores for individuals with cardiovascular disease. So we need to appreciate the limitations of the Framingham study. We need to understand the profound importance of family history and first-order relatives, which is not accounted for in any Framingham calculation. And we need to take very aggressive, robust approaches to those with premature disease. And that, too, is something I want to underscore in the course of our conversation this afternoon. Ultimately, The most effective approaches to the identification and management of cardiovascular disease or its antecedents involves systematic approaches, protocols and processes which can be introduced into practice or other professional settings, which ensure that our interventions are consistent, they are not serendipitous, and they don't wax or wane as a consequence of changing trends or changing levels of interest on the part of professionals or other members of the staff. We also need, and I realize this does not require emphasis to this audience, that risk factors for cardiovascular disease are not additive, they're multiplicative. And so once one has 3 or more cardiovascular risk factors, the level of risk increases exponentially to dramatically high levels in those who have 3 or more of those particular risk factors. And at the same time, there are those who, by virtue of their birth or place of origin, their birth, I should say, have profoundly different levels of risk at levels which are consistent with low levels of risk in a Caucasian population. So perhaps it's time that we began to think about lifetime risk as opposed to 10-year risk, given that cardiovascular disease is still almost the leading cause of preventable disease, disability, and death in Canada. And our time horizons for managing or identifying whether someone is at high risk tend to be focused over the course of a decade rather than a lifetime. And a 50-year-old male now has a 52% chance of a lifetime risk of a cardiovascular event, and a 50-year-old female has an almost 40% likelihood of developing cardiovascular disease at some time in his and her life. If you asked the Canadian population 10 years ago, what disease do you fear most? The popular response was stroke. I don't want to be incapacitated in the ways that stroke can leave one incapacitated. The public's attitude is changing somewhat as a consequence of our life expectancy being increased. And now the great concern, the specter which everyone wishes to avoid, is dementia. And it is important, I think, for us to realize, as the recognition continues to grow, that most causes of dementia, many causes of dementia, are vascular in origin, and that Alzheimer's disease is a pathological diagnosis, and the presence of those characteristic lesions does not preordain that one is demented. In fact, it's quite likely that in individuals who have those characteristic plaques, but who have evidence of hypertensive episodes throughout their adult life, are much more likely to suffer the consequences of dementia. So public expectation, public concerns are changing. And all patients, all of our patients, will benefit from the kind of common sense advice that we can provide them. I know that many of you are saying, well, when is Pipe going to talk about smoking, and the moment is here? And I can see by the way you're gripping the edges of your seats tightly that the excitement is building in this room, because this is a very important burning issue. And I want to start by saying in the next few moments I may offend a major religious organization, and at some point in this conversation I will utter the 11 words known to strike fear, terror, and loathing into the hearts and minds of Canadians from coast to coast to coast. What is it that receives less attention and yet has most impact in terms of impairing life expectancy of all of the cardiovascular risk factors? It's smoking. And it's been said that it's difficult to identify any other condition in our community which enjoys is not the right verb, which represents such a unique combination of lethality, prevalence, and neglect. And I would argue, and here we go, that that's because many of us still bring a Presbyterian approach to smoking cessation. If you were just a better person, if you could get your ducks in a row, how long have you been in my practice? You should be, are you listening to me? You should never sit in the front row. You should be able to stop smoking because after all, my Uncle Charlie smoked for 20 years and he quit, and if he could do it, why can't you? And if you don't, the next time you're in the hospital, we're going to have to amputate your leg above the knee. Guilty as charged, Your Honor. I shudder to think of the kind of messages that over the course of my career I've delivered to patients. They were cathartic for me. They were not the least bit constructive for our patients. And the paradigms of smoking cessation are changing dramatically. Rudolf Virchow, another hero of mine, said that the history of epidemics is the history of disturbances in human culture. And human culture changed with the advent of the cigarette manufacturing machine, which meant that colossal quantities of tobacco products were available cheaply and widespreadly, and in widespread fashion for the population as a whole. And we also know that there's absolutely nothing that is more important for us as physicians to address than smoking. It's the gold standard, as we will see, of preventive interventions. And here's what the tobacco industry in Canada doesn't want Canadians to discuss. 37,000 Canadians will die this year as a consequence of tobacco addiction. More than 20 Canadians, in addition to that 37,000, for every one that dies, there are 20 who are suffering the lingering and the horrible effects of tobacco-related diseases. Tobacco diseases cost nearly $4.5 billion to our system, and the total cost to our community exceeds $17 million each year. 70 million hospital days in Canada are consumed by individuals who would not be in hospital beds were they not previously or currently smokers. And this is an epidemic that we've become inured to. Oh, pipe, when are you going to get off it? Right? We kind of got the tobacco issue sorted out. Well, we haven't. And in fact, we're going to continue to pay colossal amounts to address a disease or an epidemic of diseases, all of which are preventable. And smoking cessation is the most important intervention from a cardiovascular disease perspective we can provide. There is nothing which will reduce the risk of stroke or myocardial infarction more powerfully, nor will the benefits accrue as rapidly as helping a smoker stop smoking. We know that from a secondary prevention point of view, that the risk of recurrence of disability or death declines by 36% within weeks of an individual hospitalized for myocardial infarction being helped to stop smoking. And clearly, part of the reason for our contemporary epidemic is the fact that there were social norms that have now expired. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette.